We've all heard the argument that said is dead, but what exactly does that mean?
What exactly does that mean?
Hi, my name is Sophia Terrio, and I want to teach you how to write better. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into dialogue tags, when to use said, when to use something else, and when to use nothing at all, because it's kind of a complicated world out there, she said. So, as a writer, when would I use the word said? Well, first of all, I'd use it if I want faster pacing. If the pacing of the story is really quick and things need to happen, action is taking place, I don't want to bog down the story with a bunch of complicated words. I'm gonna use said, get the job done, the reader passes right over it, and the pace continues very fast. But if I use elucidated, they might have to stop and check their thesaurus to see what I'm even talking about. I'm also going to use it when the emotionality and the characterization are already apparent. If these characters are well established and it's very obvious based on the context and what they're saying that they're angry, I don't have to use angry words. I can just use the word said because that anger is already well known to the reader. And finally, I like to use said when I'm drafting because it's easy and it keeps the writing going. I don't have to pause and check my thesaurus or my words that replace said document in order to find the exact right one. I can just use the word said and come back to it later in the editing process. So how can we find a balance between using said and these spicy, flavorful words that add more information? Well, I would say a majority of the time you're going to use either said or no dialogue tag at all. And we'll get into in a minute how you can replace the dialogue tag entirely. There's nothing more annoying in a book than when people run out of synonyms for said and start using words like ejaculated when they're describing someone speaking. Basically, rule of thumb here, you want to add a dash of spice, not the entire herb garden. Try switching up said only if you feel like it's not obvious to the reader how your character is saying something or what your character might be feeling. For example, if they are lying, using sarcasm, or doing something that would change the meaning of the sentence, or
Using sarcasm.
then that's when I would use a synonym for said. And then of course, there's always the tried and true asked if someone has posed a question. "Where's my broccoli?" she asked. So now that we've talked about a couple of different types of dialogue tags and when to use them, let's talk about how to replace the dialogue tag entirely. Not every single scene has to be littered with dialogue tags. We can sometimes use context clues to figure out which speaker is speaking. Earlier I mentioned if there's a two-character conversation and one character has just said something and then there's a paragraph break, it's very likely that the second character is now speaking. Because of that, we don't necessarily need a dialogue tag after every speaker change. Or if you're starting to feel like there's not a lot going on in the scene and you just have two talking heads, which is also kind of an issue, then you can add in description, internal monologue, and character action to beef up the scene and make it feel more grounded. This does slow the pacing of the scene pretty significantly, so use it sparingly and make sure that the words that you're using to describe the environment are also adding to the emotionality of the scene or are very efficiently describing the scene without putting too many sentences in between people's dialogue. Finally, you can add character action, which is someone doing something while they are speaking. For example, washing a dish, or brushing someone's hair, or using their hands to speak. An example sentence of this sort would be, "I lost my broccoli. She jumped up and down on the couch, clutching the sides of her head like a madwoman." Or, "I lost my broccoli. The room was filled to the brim with cauliflower, completely eclipsing the horrified expression on her face." In both of these example sentences, we referred to she, the character, in the description following the dialogue, therefore making it obvious that she was the person who spoke the dialogue. There was no line break in between these sentences. I also want to note that both of those previous examples were way longer than the first two, and that is an example of how adding character description, character action, can slow the pacing pretty significantly. If I'm reading a conversation between two characters and between every single sentence that someone says out loud, I have to read a paragraph about what their freckles look like in the moonlight, I'm going to get really bored and the conversation's going to feel really slow.
And long.
That being said, if someone is doing something and the reader needs to know about it, it's probably a good idea to add it in instead of a dialogue tag. For example, untying someone from a cage, that should be sprinkled in between the dialogue tags, so that by the time the person is untied, the reader's not like, how'd that happen? Who was doing that while this conversation was going on? This is also probably a good idea if you start a piece in media res, or as a cold open, with a line of dialogue. Having no explanation or description before the dialogue, you probably want some explanation and description after the dialogue to fill in the reader on where we are and who we're looking at and who's talking and what's going on. Finally, this comes back to the pacing again. Think about times when your conversation has a natural pause. If someone has said something and then there's a silence, now would be a great time to add in a descriptive sentence or two so that the reader, in reading it, also has a pause of silence. This can be used to add a lot of tension to a scene or to give the reader a break to breathe in between all of the action that's going on in your book, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes you gotta slow the pacing, and this is an easy way to do it. An example sentence would be, I lost my broccoli. She took a sip of her tea and waited for their reply. While I was reading, she took a sip of their tea and waited for their reply. The reader was literally waiting for their reply. It's happening in real life. The last thing I want to touch on today is, where does the dialogue tag go? So say you have a line of dialogue, 2 sentences long. Where do I put the dialogue tag? Well, the reader needs to know who's speaking. They need to know who's speaking pretty soon. However, it kind of reads pretty clunky if you put the dialogue tag in front of the dialogue. So a piece of advice that I like to follow is the dialogue tag comes after the first full sentence of dialogue. I lost my broccoli, she said, and now I have nothing to eat for dinner. I also want to note that similarly to how you might use action or description to slow the pacing where a natural pause is in conversation, I also sometimes use dialogue tags for that same effect. If someone says, hey you, and there's a pause, but it's not the end of a sentence, I might, hey you, she said, I need you down at the loading bay to get more broccoli. So ultimately it's up to you. The rule of thumb is going to be after the first full sentence of dialogue. But again, rules are meant to be broken. Use your knowledge wisely. So now you know what the big deal is with said is dead, where it comes from, why it's important, why it's maybe okay to ignore it, and how to move forward with your dialogue tags. For more tips on how to improve your writing, go ahead and hit that like button down below and subscribe and ring that bell if you want to know when I post another video. I got plenty of advice I'm ready to give. That's all for today, and I will see you next time. Happy writing.